a moment here. All right. We hit record because we already started talking, and I'm going to let the conversation continue because this is a continuation of what we kind of discussed last week with the water coming out of the rock and why is Moses and Aaron punished. But Larry, you were saying that like clear instructions were not given.
Correct.
It's like God was looking for something to be angry about. But Moses was annoyed with God. It had to do with showing his holiness, whatever that means. And I guess that God wanted it to look like he was doing the water and Moses hitting it twice interfered with that, or showing his holiness, I thought, was when Aaron and Moses went into the tabernacle and God comes and talks to them.
Yeah. But I think it's an interesting observation. It rings a weird memory of mine when I was in college and I was in the art department and I was working with an artist that they were bringing in from out of town to put in an exhibition. And he gave us some general instructions and we asked for more detail. And he's like, oh, just use your artistic sense. And so we used our artistic sense and he got mad at us because we didn't do it the way he wanted to do it, but he didn't tell us the way he wanted it.
Yeah.
And that kind of feels like there's a piece of that here where it's like God knew how God wanted it to happen and Moses didn't do it the way that God envisioned it. But also, like, why is Aaron roped into this? Like, Aaron didn't do the rock smacking.
Yeah.
Well, and he hit it twice and God said, oh, I meant once.
Yeah. Mary Ellen?
Alternately, God could have taken this as an opportunity. He had to ban Moses from the promised land at some point.
Right.
And here was an opportunity that he could just, do it and not wait to see what else these human beings were going to do to, set up the situation where he was banning Moses and Aaron from the promised land.
Right. So we talked about that a bit last week of were Moses and Aaron tired leaders that weren't actually doing their job well? Was it actually about how many times they hit the rock, or was it the way they approached the community? Was it the fact that the people are complaining again and Moses and Aaron are not handling it well? There's one more option that I think we have to consider, and that is if the people writing the story needed a reason to explain why Moses and Aaron didn't go into the promised land, and this is what they came up with.
Yeah.
If it was more retrospective looking at the story, if we're looking at this as more like a piece of literature, and the people trying to make sense of like, wait, what did Moses and Aaron do to deserve not going into the Holy Land? What did they do? Well, maybe it's this one time they handled this one situation incorrectly. And it may have hit the writers.
Yeah. Well, then didn't that already get decided that none of that generation was going into the Holy Land anyway? They were going to have to
Moses and Aaron were technically set aside from it because God often was like, I'm going to kill everyone, but I'm going to make a new nation of you. You're not going to go into the Holy Land, but like, hey, Moses and Aaron, I'm going to send you on ahead. Like God was willing to separate them often so that it is understood that the punishment of the generation passing away did not apply.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're going back to clean up their story a little.
But it does, I will say, it feels jarring, doesn't it? Because these two have been at the center of the story the whole time, and like they haven't been perfect, but none of their offenses seem to quite rise to the level of banishment. Like personally, I think if you're going to ban Aaron from entering the promised land, it would be when he made the golden calf. Like that to me is a bigger sin than being a part of the rock smacking fiasco.
Right.
Now, would Aaron have fallen into the generation that God said he was not going to allow into the Holy Land? Or is he young enough so he should have been allowed in?
Aaron is a contemporary of Moses, so would have been in the age bracket saying you're not allowed in. But like I said, he's kind of separated out as like one of God's favorites.
Okay.
And so doesn't that banishment didn't necessarily apply. But I think it's good to note that these two are old. Like they're not spring chickens.
Okay.
And that's why I wonder if some of the authors Moses does seem to have an elongated lifespan, but kind of reasoning for the fact of like, well, if they were God's like chosen leaders, why weren't they able to make this happen? Let's try to make sense of why this didn't happen.
And why did they kill him off so early? It's another 40 years.
So estimations are that the beginning of chapter 20 actually has a time jump. So in the story we're discussing today, the second half of 20, they are actually making their second approach to the promised land. The 40 years have technically passed.
Oh, okay.
So I think that also adds a little bit of color to this, that when they're going to when they're hitting the rock for the waters in that scene at the beginning of the chapter, this is not the group that left Egypt. This is their children and grandchildren.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
they never actually like specify when time passes, but the estimation is that that chapter 20 is kind of where the time jump happens. They don't actually describe the 40 years.
So we don't have to, really don't, I was worried that we were going to have to go through 40 years of complain, and God getting mad. Okay, good.
And Moses and Aaron were brothers, right?
Yes,
So they would be of the same generation.
correct. Yeah. So it is interesting though, in like, once again, thinking about the details that are preserved, we have list of names, we have genealogies, and then 40 years passes and nothing. They don't even tell us 40 years have passed. Which makes some people think that, well, did they actually spend 40 years? Or is the... But you will always get skeptics going, did it actually happen this way? Because there's no actual record of the time passing, which is interesting.
And the other thing I wonder, okay, if God says you have to wait 40 years, is that going to make Canaan any easier to go into? Is it still going to be a scary place? What makes...
I don't think it has anything to do with the people in the land they're going into, and has everything to do with, is this population ready themselves?
Are they obeying God?
Right.
Okay. And God is still hiding, hanging out in the tabernacle.
So let's actually jump to some of the second half of 20, which we're discussing today. So we have the waters of Meribah, which kind of set up the situation that they are going in the desert and they're kind of making their approach. I'm gonna pull up a map once again, just because a lot of geography is being talked about today. There we go. Here we are. All right, so just a reminder, we know this route. So they went originally to the left and up, and this is kind of the area where they were thinking about, like, can we go into the promised land? And when God said go, the people said we're scared, and then they didn't, and so it is assumed they went around this way and looped back. So they are down here in the wilderness of Zin or Paran. Oh, here we go. I know my geography. It seems that they might be in this location Punan. It is not mentioned by name, but they are talking to the king of Edom. And what they want to do is, this is the king's highway, and they are trying to make their approach to Canaan, which is up top here, but they're not going at it from the south like they tried before. And this is the way of Shur, which is likely the path they tried to take, and that they should. The original approach was going to be on this path here. So instead, the plan is to approach from the east, and they will cross the Jordan that way. And so they are asking for this highway right here.
Okay, Chris,
Yeah.
it says in the beginning they're in Kadesh. And Kadesh
Kadesh.
is over on the other side there
There.
by the wilderness of Zin. It says,
Yes.
yeah, Kadesh, but right at the beginning of verse 14, Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to
Yes.
the king of Edom.
So yes, you are correct. So that's probably, they are camping here and they're sending messengers over this little route here.
Okay.
So you're right. I have to say, my following their path all around is a little bit hazy for me, and
Yeah.
I wish they had like little arrows of which way they went first.
Who knows what?
Who knows, right? So, but that brings us to Edom. Tell me what you all remember about Edom.
Yeah, you mentioned that last week. And we were all throwing out ideas. I thought Edom was related in some way to Cain and Abel, but that wasn't right.
Not you're on the right path. You chose the wrong brothers.
The wrong brothers, yeah. What were the other two?
What are
Edom
some?
yeah, what were they? Jacob. Not Cain and Abel. That was too early. It was the other ones. It was. Well, I am not. I'm not immediately pulling them up in my brain.
Yeah, Seth is one of them.
That was-
So
Joseph's brothers.
where Cain and Abel and Seth are too early in Genesis. We're talking not about Abraham's children, but Isaac's children.
Isaac's children.
Isaac's
Isaac's
children.
children were, Joseph was the youngest, right?
Nope,
Or not? No,
that's too far.
that's too far. So we're talking about, okay,
Who are the twins?
not Abraham.
I don't see twins. I see
Wait.
Esau, Jacob, Leah, Rachel.
Right. So it's Jacob and Esau. Jacob, who
Oh,
gets
Jacob.
renamed to be Israel, and Esau is the founder of Edom.
That's right. I knew it was,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
And-
Edomites.
yeah, and Jacob is the one who goes to Egypt. Okay.
Yes. I wanted to jog your memories. I knew you would eventually get there. So the verse that, if you want to, you can go back to and look at if you want, is Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 23.
So Edom was, Jacob was the one that was tricky, and he put on the fur, put on the, yeah,
Mhm.
okay.
So the twins, if you remember, so there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So
Right.
this is when Jacob and Rachel are pregnant. And in 22, the children were struggling within her, and she says, if it is to be this way, why do I live? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people born of you shall be divided. One is stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger.
Mhm.
And so Sue, you started to recall some of the stories. We have Jacob tricking their father by wearing the fur to get the blessing of Isaac. You have Jacob tricking Esau himself to give his birthright for a cup of stew. But you have Esau then going to attack Jacob for stealing all of this, in which Jacob runs away. And then eventually they have a reunion, if you remember, after Jacob gallivants and gets his wives and many children. But then when they reunite, Esau says, hey, come with me, after like Esau approaches with his big armies. And he says, hey, brother, let's go to my camp. We can rejoice. And Jacob says, I'll meet you there. And then they split paths. And Jacob never reunites with his brother until their father dies and they like bury him together.
Mm-hmm.
And so what kind of dynamic do you expect now that they're not twins that are interacting themselves, but they have become two nations of people? What kind of interactions are we going to expect?
Well, what's happened to Esau? Is he still head of the Edomite? You know, it says that
He should be dead.
Jacob sent somebody to the king of Edom.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, this is many generations before. So like if Israel or if Jacob and Esau are twins, Esau
I see.
probably died around when Jacob
way,
did.
way back. I got
Right.
it. Yeah.
There is also my commentary is saying that there is no archaeological evidence that the Edomites had a kingdom at the time. It was likely a chief. So
Okay.
like a ruler of the area.
Mm-hmm.
So what other dynamics do you remember about Esau that we can likely apply to the Edomites? What kind of man was Esau?
He was a warrior, wasn't he?
But he what?
He was a warrior, yeah. What
He-
I mean, what were
he-
his favorite things to do? Jacob was in the tent cooking with the women. What was Esau out doing?
Hunting.
Hunting.
And what kind, how would you describe his personality that you remember? He was outside, he was hunting.
Masculine. Really,
Mhm.
yeah. And he was his father's favorite in some ways. So, because he really father probably thought Jacob was a wimp.
Mhm.
Little did he know, trickster.
Mhm. So if these two are ancient rivals from the head of two different, or like they come from the same family,
Mhm.
but they descend from two brothers, and it's kind of the personality of the two brothers is thought to be kind of like baked into the DNA of the tribes that come out of it. How are we expecting these two are going to interact, knowing that Israel is the descendant of the trickster and Edom is descended from the manly hunter, man's man?
Okay.
What can we expect?
Conflict.
Especially if they're heading for the promised land.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the Edomites are thinking when this ragtag group of people who somehow outsmarted Pharaoh is arriving on their doorstep saying, hey, we just want to pass through?
They're afraid they're going to steal their stuff.
They don't trust him.
Mhm.
Lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Plus they're retaliating probably.
Yeah. So you can see how the stories in Genesis, even though they're like family stories, they have echoes and implications because those two are seen as the archetypes, which is why the Edomites act the way they do. So Moses sends messengers, and the messengers go to the chief, the king of Edom, and says, thus says your brother Israel.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that like initial introduction? Thus says your brother. Remember us?
Well, you know, it sort of suggests a family, so at least some sort of family connection. That, you know, that the Edomites should be looking upon them as sort of, you know, potentially friendly, sort of, you know, they're part of family.
Mhm. So do you think it almost sounds like Moses is expecting an ally in this situation, right? That it's like, hey, you and us, we're on the same side, buddy. Just let us
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
You're not our enemy.
Mhm.
And then his request is literally, we want to go on this path and we want to cross through your territory. But also, Moses is giving them the heads up of, hey, Moses, unlike before, they're not just showing up. They're sending messengers ahead of them saying, hey, we have a group and we want to do this. Do we have your permission?
Mhm.
So let's talk strategy. Like, is that a good strategy on Moses's part?
Well, it's a chance of getting through peacefully.
Mm-hmm.
Unknown caller.
If he just marches in there with his army, there's going to be armed conflict.
Indeed. Other thoughts on this approach?
I don't see anything wrong with the approach. It's a pretty logical way of getting across the territory without any trouble, but it doesn't appear that it's going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so part of it is the fact that like the land of Edom is not their goal. It's like they're kind of laying out like, we don't want to fight you because we don't want your land. Our target's over there. Like,
Mhm.
we just need to get from here to there, and this is the fastest route. Like, we're not going to attack you. We don't want to do that. But there's the other side of Edom is likely a more warrior-based culture. Just like looking at kind of the archetype that we see in Genesis, they're thought to be fighting people. They wouldn't have a fun time fighting the Edomites. They really just don't want to do that.
Mhm.
And another thought when it comes to strategy, you don't want to exhaust your troops on a group that you're not planning to conquer. They just want through. They want to save their fighting force for when they need it. And this is not it.
Mhm.
So this is a reminder of the history.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And this is one of the things where this will be an ongoing conflict.
Oh, okay.
The Edomites are sometimes their allies and sometimes not. Kind of like Jacob and Esau were fighting a lot of times, but occasionally made up. We're recalling some of the dynamics of these two.
So are they still at odds after they go into the promised land?
On occasion, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. So on the Edomite side, why would you not want this group passing through your land? Why would you say no? Other than, it doesn't sound like they trust them. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, just logistically, they're gonna need a lot of water for their passage through. They're going to need fodder for their animals that they're bringing through. That promising that they will just stay on this path and not veer off of it is very suspicious to me, because you need these things to support. I mean, I'm still thinking of the thousands of people that were part of all of this with Moses. Saying they'll stay on the road and not veer off it is you know, to me, it's almost delusional that you can think you can actually do that. So,
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can trust everyone to go along with it 100% either. People might choose to stay or steal or
Straight.
be left behind, maybe get mixed in with the people that are there and intermingle, intermarry. You might lose some of them along the way.
Mm.
And plus you can't tell animals to stay on the road.
Yeah.
Mhm. So, I mean, Moses comes back and says, "Hey, we'll pay you for what we take. We're gonna own up. We're probably gonna need some water. We'll pay you for the water. You can make money off of us. Come on, it's a good deal."
Mhm.
Why still no?
That's revenge.
Because they remember their history. They don't trust them.
So there's the remembering the history. There's one other element. What happens if this people does set up shop in Canaan? What happens then?
Well,
Oh, okay.
Do you want a powerful neighbor to your north?
Okay.
If this group of people defeated Egypt, do you really want them to be your upstairs neighbor?
Mm-mm.
If they stay in the wilderness where there's not a lot of resources, they're kind of kept in check. But if they get up there where the land's nicer, it kind of poses a future danger as well.
mhm.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of reasons why this is just not a good idea for Edom to say, "Yeah, come on through. No worries. We're family." They don't want to mess with these people. And so even after they said, "Hey, we'll pay for what we have. We'll let you make money on us," they still say no, and no explanations given. So going back to the map, this is an explanation of why they end up taking the path they do. So Edom is here, and it's kind of considered like eventually they're control more of like a circle area. But what they will end up doing is making this trek across. They will come all the way to the south, most likely, and then they will go farther east to kind of go around Edom. This is what they were trying to avoid, is because they're not allowed access to this road, they have to go down and around. And this also means they will have to trek through Moab, and we are going to I believe it's next week we'll talk about Moab
Mhm.
and the history of Moab. Once again, you might want to think about where Moab comes from, because like Edom, it has a Genesis origin story to it. Yeah, Larry?
That black line leading up from, yeah, that
this one?
says the King's Highway.
Yes.
Isn't that the route they said they would stay on?
Correct. So this
Yeah.
is the road they're asking permission to walk on.
Walk on, and instead they end up having to go on the red road.
Correct.
Is Moab the place where I mean, but I'm trying to think of Jacob's father's name.
It doesn't have to do with Jacob.
It doesn't, okay, but
No.
is it for one of the wives, somebody's
So this one's a little bit harder. I actually looked it up.
there's for a wife or not, that wasn't Moab. Huh?
No. So I even had to look this one up. I remembered it had an origin and I forgot what it was. Moab deals with Lot and Lot's daughters. And so if you remember, Sodom and Gomorrah happens, Lot gets saved and his family, but his wife gets turned into a pillar of salt. His daughters panic and they get him drunk so they can make babies with their father. And Moab and another region in this area are the shameful descendants of Lot. So
Okay.
just keep that in mind, that this also has a disreputable reputation in where they're going, because it is the descendants of Lot, basically.
Is Lot in some relation to the Israelites at all? Like,
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So Lot is Abraham's nephew, so they're still considered family. So But yeah, so they have to go around Edom. They will cut through Moab, but they will eventually make it onto the King's Highway. Eventually.
Well, the King's Highway, that's a kind of interesting. Who built the King's Highway?
I would have to look that up. I don't know.
Well, and what king was it?
Oh, what I'm not going to bring it back up, but if you look closely at these maps, what you will see is the King's Highway runs along a valley in a mountain range.
Okay,
So it is the easiest place to walk. Where the Israelites have to then diverge to is a mountainous pass. So it is a much harder trek. It is much less stable terrain. It is much easier to walk through the valley that is already leveled out. So any other thoughts on geography and history and how some of these old stories are playing into our current narrative before we talk about Aaron? All right. So let's talk about the death of Aaron. So this is the jaunt with the Edomites is kind of a separation between the waters of Meribah, where God says Moses and Aaron are going to die before they go into the promised land. And Aaron doesn't make it too much farther afterwards. So, but they have a ceremony to kind of pass leadership on from Aaron to his sons. The gist of it basically being God say like, hey, take these two up a mountain. You're gonna take the vestments off of Aaron. You're gonna put them on his son, and then he's gonna be the chief priest. So what do you think of this episode of the transferal of authority and power, but also the death of Aaron?
are you talking about having it so close together, or?
Just any thoughts that come up. I mean, this part of the story, it's important to hit these points, but there's a lot of little stories that we've kind of been jaunting through.
Well, it doesn't seem, okay, I'll let Mary Ellen.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
I'm looking at verse 28, and it says Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments. I don't know about the translations and the connotation or the denotation that comes with the words, but stripped is a more aggressive type action rather than the word removed. Moses removed from Aaron of his vestments or whatever. It's a stronger, more aggressive action. And so I guess I'm just curious about the translation of these words, because for me it changes the story whether Moses very calmly kind of removed the vestments and passed the charge onto Aaron's son, or whether it was a more aggressive, violent act of your time's come, it's time for you to do this, and I'm struggling here, but I have issue with the word stripped.
Yeah. So what?
One of the things, Mary Ellen, I thought that the implication earlier was that he would be gathered unto his ancestors or something like that, which sounds like a natural death.
Yeah, so the gathered unto his ancestors is very much the Hebrew Bible way of saying he died.
Okay, it sounds more natural. In this case, it sounds sort of like a punishment. Well,
So,
it is,
yeah.
I guess, putting him
Very-
to letting his son take his place.
Mhm.
Is that what you're talking about? Very aggressive?
Hold on a second. Larry, what are you trying to jump in?
Okay, God is directing things here. Aaron's vestments are the symbol of his authority.
Oh,
Removing somebody's authority, you don't want a weak word like, hey, Aaron, take off your coat, I'm going to give it to your son. You need a strong sort of thing. Not only that, once Aaron gets his clothes off, God's going to kill him.
So there's a few interesting things. So when it's Aaron shall be gathered to his people and died there. So God doesn't smite Aaron. I
No,
think that's
no.
important to say that, like, there is not the smiting death. No lightning bolts. This is considered like a natural death. Just by the verbiage of like he died and was gathered to his people, that often means that like the person is buried with their family. Like literally their bones are put in the family tomb. They are gathered to their people. It's important to remember they don't believe in an afterlife at this point. There is no signs that there is life after death. And so being gathered to your people in Sheol is just considered like your bones are gathered together and put with the family remains. It is interesting because they don't have a family tomb at this point, but he's still gathered to his people. It's kind of like he's gathered into the earth and is like returned. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, from which you were made, thus you shall return. That kind of logic.
Yeah, and it's true, God didn't smite Aaron or anything, but it's certainly, the timing is certainly
Yeah.
like, gee, why did it happen right then?
Uh-huh. But the one thing that I do find curious, and I appreciate the question, is the word for taking off the vestments is a strong word. Mary Ellen, while you were talking, I was looking this up online. So a reminder that every Hebrew word has a root word that has the 3 consonants to it. And depending how you manipulate this word, it can have many, many meanings. Unlike English, English prefers to create a new word for a new thing. Hebrew tends to manipulate an old word to create a new word. But this one seems to be referencing to strip off, to make a dash, and to raid. So
Wow.
it does have that sense of like raiding and plundering, like taking it away. Not just like he disrobed, but it is like I am taking something from this person and putting it here.
Mhm, mhm.
This word also has at times implied like invading, putting off. There is removing, rushing, skin. It's associated also with like skinning an animal.
Mhm.
Wow. So then my question is why? Why did he have to do it that way? Was Aaron not willing to give up his vestments for his son at this point?
Mhm.
Why did Moses have to do it in this fashion?
So thinking about it this way, what did those vestments allow Aaron to do?
Gave him a lot of power.
Mm-hmm.
So he's stripping him of his power.
Yep. And thinking about like the tasks of the head priest, there's also proximity to God, right?
Right.
Mhm.
This is my assumption. This is not, I would have to do more research to try to actually prove this. My assumption is by taking off the vestments and putting them on a new person, it is stripping Aaron of the capacity to be in proximity to God. Because it is basically such an elevated position, in order to transfer that to someone else, Aaron has to be knocked down the ladder of holiness.
Mhm.
That these vestments are considered almost magical. Not in the like they give him special powers, but in the it gives him proximity to God that, remember, the other people can't do. Other people who get as close to God as Aaron does, they burn alive.
Mhm.
And so I think the stripping of it is almost like peeling an orange, like taking that protective layer off, and like Aaron is becoming more vulnerable
Mhm.
to God's presence. But that has to happen for these like divinely charged objects to be put onto his son. There has to be a transfer And so basically his son gets suited up in the holiness that those garments and that position entails. That is my personal interpretation, but I think of it as kind of like taking off this protective layer of holiness. Yeah, Larry.
And once he's lost that, he dies.
There's a chance that he has had prolonged life because of some of this, that proximity thing that he is. I'm going to take a guess and say he's lived longer than most other people in his generation. But maybe I've just read too much fantasy stories of like when you strip the magical object and then all of a sudden the person withers and dies just because they don't have their magical object anymore. But it does seem to be like there is some of this connection here. But it seems like one of the important things is Aaron doesn't die and how do I say this? So death is considered one of the things that has like contamination on it. We didn't go through this in Leviticus, but like when a person dies, anyone who handles it is considered unclean. So Aaron doesn't die with the vestments on. It is important to transfer the vestments before he dies. Because you don't want to contaminate the holy garments that allow the person like special protection to go into the Holy of Holies. And so you before he dies, you strip him down, you give it to his son, and then they're protected. The holiness is protected from death and decay. So magical objects aside, how, as the people on the ground, what do you think of this? Like, there's been lots of questioning of authority of both Moses and Aaron, and all of a sudden, like, we've had lots of proof that Aaron is God's, like, go-to priest, and now Aaron's passed away and his son comes down wearing his clothes. Is that a convincing argument that the torch has been passed alone? 3 men go up, 2 men come down. What's it like for the people on the ground who watched?
I would think they'd be kind of freaked out. Or do they know that Aaron's in trouble? Do they know that Aaron was in trouble before?
In trouble in what way? Like he is in danger, or like in trouble as in did they know that he messed up and was gonna get punished? Which one are you asking?
That he messed up and he's going to get punished.
I don't know. I guess either way, the answer is I don't know how much the people know. There is a likelihood that the people would have found out that, yeah, Aaron's not going to be the guy leading them in.
I would think they were shocked.
Yeah. Yeah, Gary, then Mary Ellen.
Well, we use the word that, or the phrase that Aaron is punished. I'm not all that comfortable with that he was punished. His stint had been completed. It was time to go to a younger generation, a new leadership. And the transition was quite emphatic. It has to be that the moving of the garments and placing them on his son. Well, I think that's it. That's what my concern was.
Okay. Mary Ellen, what were you thinking?
Well, along the same lines as Gary, that they knew Aaron was elderly, that he probably had some of the ailments of natural elderly concerns, where you're slowing down and whatever. And so to see just 2 men come down when 3 went up would be a shock. But I could see where they could accept it as natural progression as people age. And going up the mountain is symbolic, as everything that seems to happen that's really, really important happens up on a mountain. So when they came down, I think they gave proper respect to Aaron's death. When they talk about mourning for 30 days rather than 7, you know, I think there's just a lot of acceptance just with natural progression of age, you know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. In some ways, it's if we remember their worldview, that there are the realm above the sky, the top of the mountain is the closest place you can get to heaven, where God resides theoretically. And so being able to die at that high point means you are close to holiness.
yeah.
But I think I there is the tension between, like, Aaron was probably old, and it brings up the question of, like, how do you have a respectful death? And this in some ways feels like they're trying to give him the amount of respect that he is due for being a leader of the people. At the same time, we do have the previous story where God says, "Hey, you messed up." And there are consequences to your mess up, and that, but I think our initial discussion that we had slightly off camera was, I think, important to think of whether this is like the people trying to understand why Aaron died at this point, or if Aaron is being punished, or is this just part of the story where, like, it was time to pass the torch, and so how do you do that respectfully? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I'm thinking, you know, as we're talking about this all happening at the top of the mountain, I think he died a very honorable death in their eyes. Because, you know, what you say about being the top of the mountain is as close to God as they could get. You know, and so to me, that helps them accept it in that fashion. If he had been murdered, if he had been, if he died in his vestments of an illness and contaminated the vestments, I mean, the death would have been seen as very different than the way this happened. So I don't know if I'm answering the original question, but this discussion is helping me see that this was a good way for Aaron to go.
The other helpful thing is Aaron had more than one son. Doing it this way has a clear line of succession, rather than people bickering and fighting over who's going to be the next high priest. That's already been decided. And so the vestments are transferred pre-death, and so the next one is going to be able to pick up without, like, a fight of, or like a new one where everyone gets to write their name on a stick and put it before the Ark of the Covenant, and we're going to wait to see which stick blooms again. No, instead it's transferred pre-death, and we have a line of succession.
Was this son his oldest?
I believe so.
Okay.
And so at this point, Moses is the only one left. The only one left from the generation. The only one left of his family, because Miriam has also passed away at this point. So Moses is kind of the last there is, and we kind of take up the story from here. So, any other lingering thoughts for today about either of these scenarios, or kind of setting us up for the actual approach, the final approach to the Holy Land? Yeah.
I guess I just want to reiterate that the respect that the people showed Aaron, because I read in the commentary below that they normally just mourn for 7 days, and they gave him 30 days, which again, with this number business in the Old Testament, I don't know if it was actually 30 days, but a much longer time than it was for a normal person. So the people were honoring Aaron in his death.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. I kind of skipped over it. Yeah. Their mourning period is extended, and the same thing's going to happen with Moses. When Moses dies, they're going to mourn for an extended period of time. So this isn't just anyone dying. There's a lot of things that Aaron did, even if he was like kind of number 2 to Moses, like they are holding up that like Aaron has done a lot in his life and was an important person along the way. Other
So
thoughts?
they're going to have to go do away with Moses pretty quickly.
Nope.
If they're on the way, no?
Let's see. I think we're almost at the Numbers. Oh wow. We are not going to read all of Numbers, but
Okay, so it all takes place in Numbers.
um
Okay,
the
he gets to
so
live. He's going to have to talk for himself.
a quick preview kind of to set up the rest of the timeline for Numbers, because we only have a few weeks left. Because we're still kind of like skipping stones over the top and only hitting the story bits. Numbers is the end of the narrative of the Exodus. Deuteronomy is a sermon. When you look at when Deuteronomy was written, it is written long after the story was kind of assembled. It is written by a person called the Deuteronomistic historian, which is your $10 word that academics use to say this other author. So Deuteronomy is a case unto itself. It is not dissimilar to the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have similar sources, and then the Gospel of John is just off on its own, doing its own thing. Deuteronomy is kind of similar, where Deuteronomy is kind of just off on the side, doing its own thing. What Deuteronomy historically is understood to be is Moses's final sermon to the people right before they enter the promised land. So it is a long sermon, and it hits a lot of the high points of the previous books. It also has a lot of like, remember this law and remember this law. So you have like, remember the 10 commandments and remember this and a few other additions. It doesn't ever just like clearly repeat. It says it with a little bit of difference, and it adds in some new stuff. So Deuteronomy is really weird. But Moses dies in Deuteronomy, but it's important to know that Deuteronomy theoretically is one moment in time. It's literally Moses standing up in front of these whole people and just talking for hours and then dying.
So they don't go into the promised land in the Torah.
No, they don't.
That's kind of interesting.
It is interesting. So they only actually cross the Jordan in the book of Joshua.
Right, Joshua beat the battle of Jericho here. Okay. Oh, I want to mention that there's going to be a documentary on Moses on Netflix. And at first I thought it was going to be a, Burt Lancaster kind of thing, but they've got scholars commenting and everything. It starts tomorrow. I don't know if it's any good or not, but I just saw an ad for it.
All right. You all will have to report back and tell me if you know more than the documentary does.
We'll have to see. I look forward to it.
Oh, that's funny. Okay. Alrighty. Well, any final thoughts or any other final thoughts, or should I pray us out for today?
Okay.
Yeah, Gary?
Just as a side note, last week we were talking about the human practice, or the idea that people are promoted too often beyond their competence and skill level. And that is referred to as the Peter principle. And it's the disciple Peter. It was a gentleman by the name of Peter that was a business, researcher, manager, or whatever. So I know we were struggling trying to think about what does that mean? What is the name of it? That process.
Yeah.
Process, I guess.
Oh, well, thank you for researching that. That's cool to know. All right. Well, let us pray for today. Gracious and loving God, we read today a story about conflict that seems to go through the generations, where it didn't stop with two brothers, but continues on through their children and their children's children and the nations that grew out of their personalities. And we look around the world today and we can see the very thing happening, where problems that began centuries before have echoes and conflict remains, and it is frustrating when it seems like there is no end between groups that have been feuding for centuries. And so we pray for peace. We pray for resolution, that even brothers who couldn't get along, that their descendants can find ways to forge peace that they could not. And we also read about the honorable death of leaders. And so we also pray for our leaders, that they know when to step down, when they know when they have reached their end of effectiveness, and we pray for the people that they lead, that they may honor the leaders before them when they do step down, that we may give them the respect that is due. And so, God, as we approach this Holy Week, knowing that the darkest parts of the gospel story are ahead of us this week, but also knowing that the empty tomb is close at hand as well, we ask that you guide us through the troubles of this world, knowing that there is hope and resurrection on the other side of what seems like world-ending troubles. And so be with us and guide us through this week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Have a great week, everybody.
You too.
Well,
I see it's warm down there.
Yeah.